Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The Lizard of California. I had waited a long time for this trip. The California desert, with its seemingly endless trails, rugged canyons, and stretches of untouched land, promised solitude, beauty, and the thrill of stepping into the unknown. As I laced up my hiking boots and took the first few steps into the vast, open wilderness, I felt that familiar rush of excitement mixed with a faint, unspoken nervousness, a feeling I'd come to expect on these solo hikes. The air was dry and hot, already thick with the scent of sun-baked rock and sage. The early sun cast sharp, almost blinding rays across the earth, painting the landscape in shades of amber and red. The ground cracked beneath my feet with each step, and an oppressive silence hung in the air, the kind that only a desert can hold, heavy, thick, pressing down like an invisible weight. The trail ahead wound through jagged rocks and low-lying shrubs, some brittle and brown, others gray with dust. I'd done hikes like this many times before, but something about this one felt different. As I moved deeper into the wilderness, a strange sensation began to settle over me, like an itch I couldn't scratch, a slight prickling along the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was miles from the nearest person. I stopped and glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see another hiker on the trail. But there was nothing, only the silent, empty stretch of dusty land fading into the hills beyond. No movement, no sound. Just me in the desert. Just my imagination, I muttered, forcing a laugh to cut through the silence. Yet, as I turned and continued forward, the sensation lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It was subtle at first, like an itch or a faint vibration in the air, but the longer I walked, the stronger it grew. I couldn't put a name to it, but it was as if something unseen was out there, watching me, waiting. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling, my footsteps kicking up small clouds of dust. But even as I walked, I couldn't ignore the heavy silence pressing down on me. I could hear my own breathing, steady but sharp, louder than usual in the oppressive quiet. Every step seemed to echo off the rocks, though I was certain that the sound of my footsteps wasn't the only one I was hearing. There was something else, a faint rustling behind me, so subtle it could have been the breeze stirring the dry shrubs. I stopped again, my senses heightened, scanning the landscape, my eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. But the desert remained still, the shrubs unmoving, as if frozen in time. An uneasy chuckle escaped me. "It's just the wind," I muttered, though I couldn't ignore the crawling sensation that persisted at the base of my spine. I started walking again, forcing myself to focus on the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was as if something, or someone, was trailing me, staying just out of sight. The thought gnawed at my nerves, but I pushed it down, determined to keep going. As I pushed onward, the quiet was almost unnerving. Every so often, I paused to take in the vast, empty beauty around me, the jagged rock formations, the dry creek beds, the occasional scattering of desert flowers, their vibrant colors like drops of paint on an otherwise barren canvas. But with each pause, I'd catch the faintest of sounds behind me, a low, distant scraping, like claws against stone. At first, I brushed it off as my own footsteps echoing off the rocks. The desert has a way of playing tricks on the mind, and sound travels strangely out here. It's just the rocks settling, I told myself. Maybe a loose pebble rolling down a slope or an animal rustling in the bushes. Yet, each time I stopped to listen, there was a moment of silence, a heavy, almost anticipatory pause, as if whatever was making the noise knew I was listening and had gone still. It was too subtle to be anything other than a coincidence, I reasoned. But the sound would return, just faintly enough to raise the hairs on my neck before vanishing again. I tried to focus on other things, hoping the distraction would ease the unease building within me. The desert sky was a vast, cloudless blue, stretching endlessly above me, and the sun cast long, stretching shadows across the ground. But every so often, that strange scratching sound would break through the silence, closer now, with a rhythmic quality to it, almost like footsteps, though too soft and scraping to be human. Just a bird, maybe, I muttered, trying to convince myself, though it didn't feel right. No bird or animal I ever encountered in the desert made sounds like that. And whatever it was, it seemed to be following me, moving when I moved, pausing when I paused. I felt a nervous laugh rising in my throat, but forced it down, swallowing hard. I was too far into this trail to turn back now, I told myself. But with each step, my mind kept returning to the sound, that faint scrape just behind me. The path twisted and wound through a series of large boulders, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch across the ground, bending and shifting as I moved past. The strange noise had faded for now, but the tension it left behind hung thick in the air. I kept my eyes trained ahead, focusing on the trail, trying to push away the lingering sense of unease. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow, a strange shape that stood out against the rough patterns of the rocks. I turned to look, my heart skipping a beat. There, far in the distance, I could make out an unusual outline against the light brown of the desert floor. At first, I thought it was just another rock formation, maybe a trick of the harsh light playing on my senses. But something about its shape was wrong. It was elongated, low to the ground, and it seemed almost like it was hunched, as if watching or waiting. A shiver ran down my spine as I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure was too far away, distorted by heat waves shimmering off the ground. I stood frozen, feeling my pulse quicken as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a large cactus or a shrub bending in an odd way, I told myself. Or perhaps it was a shadow cast by some oddly shaped rock. But deep down, a whisper of doubt gnawed at my mind, a primal instinct that told me this shadow didn't belong here. I blinked, and when I looked again, the shape was gone. Just empty desert stretching as far as I could see, silent and still. I took a shaky breath, rubbing my eyes, trying to dismiss it as a mirage, a trick of my tired eyes and the heat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching from the edges of the trail, waiting just beyond my sight. As I pressed onward, a gnawing unease settled over me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, scanning the barren landscape, straining to catch any hint of movement. That shadow I'd seen, it had felt too real, too deliberate to be just a trick of the light. My mind raced, trying to latch onto anything that would explain away the unsettling thoughts swirling inside me. The silence around me felt heavier now, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it again, the faint scraping sound, the one I tried so hard to dismiss. This time, it was closer, more distinct, as if something was slowly dragging itself across the rocks, closing the distance between us. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the rising panic that was threatening to take hold. Each step I took felt loud, echoing in the silent expanse, almost as if it was inviting whatever was out there to follow. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, every nerve on high alert, picking up even the slightest rustle of wind through the dry shrubs. But it wasn't just the wind. I could tell now. The scraping and shifting were too deliberate, too steady, and they grew louder with each passing moment. Whatever it was moving toward me, and it was relentless, never pausing, never hesitating. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to listen. The sound halted too, as if my stillness had been matched by an unseen predator. My skin prickled as I stood there, frozen, holding my breath. A part of me wanted to turn around, to look and face whatever was out there. But a deeper, instinctual fear kept me rooted in place, whispering that whatever was following me was best left unseen. A chill gripped me as I stood there, still and silent, torn between the urge to turn around and the deeper fear of what I might see if I did. The desert was vast and empty, yet it felt as though it had somehow closed in on me, narrowing to a single, suffocating path that pressed me forward. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and finally decided that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to see what was behind me, what had been following me all this time. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and turned, ready to confront the silent presence that haunted my steps. But as soon as I shifted, a strange sensation washed over me, an almost invisible weight settled onto my shoulders, subtle yet undeniable, urging me to turn back around. My body felt heavy, my feet suddenly reluctant to follow my mind's command. It was as if something was pulling me forward, whispering that I had to keep moving, that there was no reason to look back. I shook my head, fighting the feeling, but the pull only grew stronger, sinking deeper into my mind, making every step backward feel like an impossible effort. My own thoughts began to feel clouded, as though my reasons for turning back were slipping away, replaced by a new compulsion, one that insisted I keep going forward. I staggered, torn between the instinct to flee and the unexplainable urge to continue down the path. "No, this isn't right," I whispered, trying to clear my mind. But my legs had already resumed moving, almost on their own, pulling me forward like a puppet on strings. I struggled against it, but whatever was driving me seemed to grow stronger with every step, taking root in my mind. A faint, disturbing thought crept into my mind. Perhaps I wasn't just imagining the sounds or the shadow. Perhaps whatever was behind me didn't need to force me to turn, it only needed me to keep moving, to lead me exactly where it wanted. I finally stopped. Sweat dripped down my forehead, and my legs ached with each step, but it wasn't just the physical exhaustion weighing on me. There was something heavier, a persistent unease that refused to leave me. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but it felt like I was trapped in an invisible box, suffocated by the air around me, by the sound of my own breath. I found a large boulder by the side of the trail, its jagged surface offering a semblance of shelter from the burning sun. I sank down onto it, trying to calm my racing heart. The silence of the desert should have been peaceful, but now it felt oppressive, suffocating. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I kept replaying everything that had happened, the strange shadow, the scraping sound, and now this overwhelming sense of something close, something that hadn't let up since I first stepped onto the trail. I wiped the back of my neck with the sleeve of my shirt, attempting to shake off the creeping dread that seemed to coil itself tighter with each passing minute. I was alone, and I knew the desert had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Still, no matter how I tried to convince myself otherwise, the feeling of being watched never went away. I couldn't escape it. "Focus," I muttered aloud, trying to ground myself in the present, to ignore the irrational thoughts clouding my judgment. The heat, the isolation, it had to be getting to me. My instincts had always been sharp, but now they were just tangled with fear, making me see things that weren't there. That shadow had to be a trick of the light. The noises, the scraping, probably just some animal passing by, or the wind stirring up debris. But even as I thought that, I couldn't fully believe it. Something deep within me, some primal sense, refused to accept the explanations I so desperately wanted to believe. Every inch of the desert around me felt alive with a low hum of tension, the air vibrating with a presence I couldn't quite place. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to settle my thoughts. The stillness was maddening, but even the smallest sound seemed amplified, the rustle of a distant bush, the occasional scurry of insects underfoot. I kept telling myself it was just the desert. But then, there it was again. The scraping. The faintest sound, like claws dragging against stone. It was so subtle, almost indistinguishable from the wind at first. But now, I was certain it was real. I opened my eyes, scanning the horizon. The trail ahead was empty, the same barren stretch of desert I had been walking for hours, yet that feeling of being watched had only grown more intense, more invasive. I couldn't shake the thought that I was not alone here. That something was in the distance, watching, waiting. My chest tightened as the panic began to creep back, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. Something I couldn't see but knew was getting closer. My thoughts spun in anxious circles, and with each passing moment, the desert seemed to draw closer, its vast emptiness closing in around me. I couldn't sit still anymore. The unease in my chest had grown so thick it was almost suffocating. The air felt wrong now, charged with something I couldn't name. My mind raced as I tried to explain the sensations away, but each time I did, the doubt would creep back in, sinking deeper until it consumed every rational thought. I stood up abruptly, my hands shaking as I brushed off the dirt from my pants. The small boulder I'd been sitting on felt colder now, as though it had absorbed some of the dread that had been festering within me. I needed to keep moving. The longer I stayed in one place, the more those odd feelings seemed to fester, swirling around me like the heat from the ground. I took a few steps away from my resting spot, trying to refocus on the trail ahead. But as I moved, something caught my eye, something that made my stomach flip. Around the base of the boulder where I had been sitting, the ground was disturbed. The dust had been kicked up, and the surface was scraped in a series of odd marks, like deep grooves. My eyes narrowed as I crouched down for a closer look, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. At first, I thought they were just the tracks of some animal, maybe a large lizard or a coyote. But something about them didn't sit right. The grooves weren't random, they were methodical, as if something had been circling around me, pausing, then moving again in tight, deliberate patterns. The marks were deep and wide, like claws had raked across the earth, dragging through the dust and leaving behind sharp indentations in the shape of large paws. I froze. I knew that no animal I'd seen in the desert would leave marks like these, nothing with paws this large, nothing that could make grooves like this. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I instinctively took a step back, my eyes darting around the area as if expecting something to spring from the shadows. There was no wind here, nothing that could explain the strange patterns. No animal tracks leading in or out. Just these deep, deliberate marks, as though something had been pacing around me while I sat, waiting, studying me. A low rumble of fear began to churn in my stomach. The desert had always felt like an intimidating place, but now it felt hostile, as if it were hiding something beneath its dry surface, something that was drawing closer with each passing moment. I stood there for a long time, staring at the marks, unable to look away. I had seen the shadow earlier, heard the scraping noise, and now these tracks. They all pointed to the same terrifying possibility that whatever had been following me was not just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was out there, circling, waiting. With a deep breath, I slowly backed away from the marks. My thoughts scrambled in 1,000 directions, but one thing was certain now: I was no longer just a hiker in the desert. I was prey. And whatever was watching me, whatever had left these marks, was far from human. My mind was spinning, the logical part of me screaming to run, to find a way out of this nightmare, but my legs felt like stone, unwilling to move. I had to get a grip, to calm myself. I had to focus on something that made sense, something that could help me understand what was happening, or at least give me some kind of explanation. I took a few steps back toward my pack, the unsettling tracks behind me still burning in my mind. As I rifled through the contents, my fingers brushed against something hard, something that didn't belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was a small object, half buried in the sand. I crouched down and pulled it from the dirt. An old camera. Its body was scratched and worn, like it had been here for years. The lens was cracked, and the strap was frayed, barely hanging on. It was an odd thing to find in the middle of nowhere, especially in a place so isolated, so far from any trails or human presence. Who would leave something like this here? Curiosity overcame my unease. I turned the camera over in my hands, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain its presence. As I inspected it, I noticed a strip of film still loaded inside. Without thinking, I pulled the film out carefully, my hands trembling. There was something about this object, something that felt wrong. But I had to see what was on it. I found a small portable viewer in my bag, the kind I'd used when I was younger to develop film at home. My fingers hesitated over the buttons for a moment before I slid the film into the viewer. The first few images were blurry, the kind of shots that were ruined by shaky hands or poor lighting. But then something caught my eye. The next photo was clearer. There, in the corner of the frame, a shape. It was faint, almost ghostly, but unmistakable. A long, coiled form, like a shadow in the desert. The creature seemed to be crouching, its gaze, directed at the camera. The more I looked, the more details began to surface. A long, elongated body, scaly skin, the faintest outline of claws. It was unmistakable. The figure was that of a lizard, but it was enormous. Its shape distorted and blurry, as though it didn't quite belong in this world. I pulled the next photo from the film, and this time the lizard-like creature was clearer. Its head was turned, its eyes wide, unblinking. A cold shiver crawled down my spine as I realized that this creature wasn't just in the background, it was in the foreground now, clearly the focus of the image. The body was massive, far too large for any normal desert creature I'd ever seen. And the most terrifying thing of all? The way it seemed to be watching. I snapped another picture, then another. Each one blurred and distorted, as though something had interfered with the camera's lens. But each one revealed more details, more unsettling features that I couldn't fully comprehend. There it was again. The same creature. But it wasn't just in the photos. It was in my mind now. Watching me, tracking me. I wasn't sure if the images were meant to warn me or if they were proof that whatever this thing was had been here long before me. I sat there, holding the camera in trembling hands, my mind racing. The tracks, the sounds, the shadows, it was all connected. This creature, this lizard, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. And it had been watching me from the moment I entered this desert, just as it had watched the person who owned the camera before me. The weight of it all hit me at once. I wasn't alone. And whatever had left those tracks, whatever was behind those photos, wasn't going to let me leave. I stood there, holding the camera, my mind in a haze. I wanted to scream, to toss the camera aside and run until my legs gave out. But something held me there, frozen in place, as though the images in my mind had already taken root, burying themselves deep into my thoughts. "No," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. This is just a coincidence. A series of random events, nothing more." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe it. The alternative, what the camera and those tracks seemed to suggest, was far too horrific to even entertain. A giant, predatory lizard in the desert, stalking me like prey? It sounded insane, absurd. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone else had been out here before me, someone who had seen the creature and left the camera behind. Maybe those tracks weren't from anything supernatural, they were just the result of wind or the movement of some large desert creature I hadn't yet encountered. I gripped the camera harder, pressing it against my chest, trying to ground myself, to force my thoughts to make sense. But with each passing moment, the unease grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I looked up at the desert landscape, trying to refocus, trying to push the creeping sense of dread to the back of my mind. I had to keep moving. I had to get to the next checkpoint, the next safe spot. But then I noticed it. A small detail that made my stomach tighten, my breath hitch in my chest. I had been walking for hours, but I had not been paying attention to the path I was taking. I looked around me, realizing with a sudden shock that I was no longer heading in the direction I had planned. I had no idea how long I'd been walking in the wrong direction. My feet had carried me in a slow, almost hypnotic daze, one step after another, as if they knew the way better than my own mind did. But now, standing in the middle of the desert, I could see it. The landmarks ahead, those jagged rock formations I had passed hours ago, were now behind me. The path I was supposed to follow was nowhere in sight. I cursed softly under my breath. How had I let this happen? I was supposed to be heading west, toward the next safe zone, toward the nearest ranger station. But now I was deep into unfamiliar terrain. And I could feel it, the weight of the desert closing in around me. The way the silence, once a comforting presence, now felt like an oppressive weight pressing against my chest. I glanced back at the camera, my mind racing for an explanation. Had I wandered off course while I was lost in thought, consumed by the paranoia that had been building inside me? Or had something else, something more sinister, been pulling me off track, nudging me toward an unknown destination? The gnawing suspicion that the latter was true ate away at me. But no, I had to stay rational. It had to be a mistake, a lapse in my attention. It had to be. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The desert was vast, yes, but I could still get back on track. I would find the right path again. I would. I had no choice. But as I began walking once more, a thought lingered at the back of my mind, unsettling and cold. The feeling that I wasn't walking towards safety at all. That, somehow, I was being led in the wrong direction, towards something far darker than I could understand. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert in an oppressive cloak of darkness. The temperature dropped rapidly, but the chill wasn't enough to cool the panic simmering in my chest. I had lost all sense of time, but I knew I couldn't afford to waste any more daylight. My legs felt like lead, each step harder than the last, but I kept moving, driven by something deeper than the mere instinct to survive. It was fear, pure and raw, that propelled me forward, as if something behind me was pushing me into the dark. The air now felt thick and heavy, pressing down on me, suffocating. The sky was a blanket of black, dotted with distant stars, but there was no comfort to be found in their beauty. The vastness of the desert had always been intimidating, but now it felt like a trap. I had lost track of the path entirely. Every direction seemed the same, the land stretching out endlessly, a maze of sand and rock. The shadows grew longer, stretching and shifting in the periphery of my vision, making my mind play tricks on me. I stopped and set up camp in a small hollow, hoping to get some rest before I could start again at first light. But the exhaustion in my body was different from the fear gnawing at my soul. I lay there, staring into the blackness, straining my ears for any sound that wasn't the faint rustle of the wind against the dunes. Then it came. A faint rustling, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was just the wind, stirring the sand, but then it repeated. A soft, deliberate step, followed by another. And another. My heart lurched in my chest. The sound wasn't natural, it was too measured, too close. The footsteps were heavy, almost purposeful. They were following me. I sat up, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It was difficult to tell the exact direction of the sound in the vast emptiness of the desert. I scanned the darkness, but everything was a mass of indistinct shadows. The light from the small campfire I had set up did little to cut through the dark. I strained to listen, my hands gripping the edge of my pack. The footsteps were closer now. My eyes darted to the horizon, searching for any movement, any sign of what was out there. But the desert was still, unnervingly still, save for that faint sound, footsteps crunching through the sand, deliberate and measured. I swallowed hard, trying to control the rising panic. Maybe it was an animal, a coyote or something else native to the desert. That's all it could be. Just an animal. But even as I tried to convince myself, the sound didn't fade. It got louder, closer. The footsteps didn't stop. They were too rhythmic, too consistent to be random. My eyes darted to the shadows around me again, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that sound. I had to know. But there was nothing. Just the deep, empty black of the desert surrounding me. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The desert was silent once more, but the silence was far more terrifying than any noise could have been. It was as though whatever had been following me had paused, waiting for something. Waiting for me to move, to make a mistake. The stillness was suffocating. I slowly rose to my feet, my hands trembling as I reached for the flashlight in my bag. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the beam of light in a wide arc, desperately searching for something, anything that could explain the noise. Nothing. Just the same dark expanse of sand, rock, and shadows. But then, as the light flicked across the ground, I saw it. The faintest movement, just outside the circle of light, a shadow flitting across the sand, too large, too fast to be anything natural. It was there and gone in an instant, but the impression of it remained burned in my mind. I wasn't alone. The footsteps resumed, this time even closer, echoing in the hollow of my chest. The creature was here, stalking me under the cover of night. I could feel it, closer now than ever before. My body tensed, every muscle screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The desert had become my prison. I forced myself to turn off the flashlight, the darkness swallowing me whole once again. I crouched low to the ground, holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. Every nerve in my body screamed in terror, but I couldn't move. Not yet. Not until I knew exactly what was out there, watching, waiting for me to make the first move. The sound of those steps, the only thing that seemed real in that suffocating darkness, was drawing nearer, and I had no idea what to do next. The night had been a blur of shadows and sound, a terrible stretch of time where I couldn't decide if I was awake or lost in some fevered dream. The desert's oppressive silence had seemed to swallow me whole, but now, as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, I saw it with a clarity I hadn't expected. The beast. I had barely slept, my body stiff, aching from the tension of the night. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands shaky, but I couldn't bring myself to move from my spot. I knew something was out there, something watching. Something that had been following me for hours, maybe longer. And now, in the early light of morning, I saw it. It wasn't far from me, just beyond the rocks where I'd last glimpsed the shifting shadow. The creature was still, watching me. It was huge, massive, even. Its body stretched long, each muscle defined under its sleek, leathery skin. It was a lizard, yes, but not one I had ever seen before. It had to be some twisted version of reality itself, a creature that didn't belong. Its scales shimmered with an unnatural luster, dark shades of green and brown that seemed to shift with the light. But it wasn't the size that gripped my attention. It was its eyes. Those eyes, piercing, hypnotic, seemed to draw me in, forcing my gaze to meet theirs. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. They were large, far too large for the head of any creature I knew, and they glowed faintly in the dawn light, swirling with an eerie golden hue. It was like they were alive, like they held within them some kind of secret, some hidden power that beckoned me. My heart began to race as the lizard's eyes locked with mine. I felt a strange sensation spreading through my body, like my limbs were growing heavy, my thoughts growing distant. It was as though my mind was no longer my own, being pulled into some unseen force that surrounded us both. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. No. Don't look at it. Don't look at those eyes. But it was too late. They had already ensnared me. The creature didn't move, yet I felt its presence closing in on me, slowly and steadily. It was as if the very air between us thickened, crackling with energy I couldn't comprehend. A low, almost inaudible hum began to fill my ears, as though the creature was emitting some kind of pulse that resonated deep within my chest. I felt my heartbeat align with the rhythm, slower, deeper, more controlled. I was frozen in place, my breath shallow. My body was no longer my own. It was as though I was simply an observer in my own skin, watching as my fingers twitched, as my body began to inch forward, drawn to the creature in front of me. I tried to force myself to turn away, to break free, but the more I fought it, the stronger the pull became. My muscles refused to obey my commands. The world around me began to fade into a blur, and all that existed now were those eyes, glowing brighter with each passing second. This can't be real, I thought desperately. It's just a trick. It's just the desert, playing tricks on me. It's just my exhaustion. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew it was a lie. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't my mind unraveling. This was something far worse. Something real. The creature was more than just an animal. It was controlling me, manipulating me, pulling me deeper into its thrall. I felt my feet move again, one step after another, without conscious thought. I was walking toward it, no longer able to stop myself. The desert, the world, the very air around me seemed to distort, twisting, bending to the rhythm of those eyes. I stumbled forward, my body unwilling to fight anymore, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What is this thing? What does it want? But no answer came, only the pull of those golden, hypnotic eyes. I was lost in them now, and I couldn't escape. The longer I stared into its eyes, the more I felt myself slipping, like I was being pulled into a deep, dark void. My mind raced in desperate, incoherent thoughts, trying to understand, trying to fight back, but the harder I fought, the less control I had. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to, but at the same time, every fiber of my being screamed for me to break free. Its gaze was like a vice, pressing against my skull, against my thoughts, squeezing until I couldn't think clearly. It wasn't just that I was immobilized, it was something deeper, something far more terrifying. The pressure in my chest intensified, and I felt a tightness in my throat, as though I was suffocating under the weight of its stare. I wanted to scream, to run, to turn around and escape. But my legs, my arms, nothing obeyed me. The fear that gripped me was no longer just a mental panic, it was physical. My body felt like a foreign thing, something I could no longer control. This isn't real, I thought. It's not real. Just look away. Look away and it will end. But my eyes remained locked on those terrible, glowing pupils. The creature's eyes weren't just beautiful, they were insidious. The longer I looked, the more I felt myself drowning in them. A sinking sensation filled my stomach, as though I were falling into a pit, spiraling deeper and deeper. Every thought, every rational explanation, crumbled to dust. My body no longer belonged to me. My feet took a step forward on their own, dragging me across the sand, closer to the creature. I could feel the heat of its gaze searing into me, like a furnace, burning away my will, my resistance. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as though it wasn't me walking but some unseen force puppeteering my limbs. I could barely keep my eyes open, yet I couldn't bring myself to look away. It was as if some invisible string connected me to the creature, drawing me in with an undeniable force. I tried to raise my hand, to shake my head, to break free from whatever this was, but the effort was futile. It was like trying to move underwater, my limbs sluggish and unresponsive. Every motion was sluggish, as though time itself was stretching, slowing, becoming thick and viscous. Focus. Focus. Fight it. The words echoed in my mind, but they seemed distant like a voice from another world. But then, another sensation cut through the fog. A pull, deep within my chest, as if something inside me was being drawn toward the creature's gaze. It wasn't just my body moving, it felt like my very soul was being tugged forward. My thoughts blurred, melting together, until I no longer cared about anything except the thing in front of me. I heard my own voice then, weak and distant, like it came from someone else. Stop, stop. It didn't matter. The words were useless. The desert around me faded, slipping away like a mirage, until all I could see was the creature. The air grew still, the world silent except for the pounding of my own heart in my ears, and the pull, relentless, suffocating, drawing me into the creature's orbit. There was no escape from its gaze. No escape from whatever it was doing to me. I didn't know how much time had passed, or if time even existed in this moment. The creature had me, completely and utterly. Every part of me was sinking into its presence. My body was no longer my own. I tried to scream again, but the sound wouldn't come. It was as if my vocal cords had stopped working altogether. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. Nothing but the gaze. Those awful, mesmerizing eyes. The world around me had become irrelevant. My mind, my sense of self, was crumbling under the pressure. There was only the creature now, and the terrifying, terrible certainty that it controlled me. That it had always controlled me. And the more I looked, the more I became its puppet. I felt my hands twitch. My fingers curled into fists on their own, and I knew, without a doubt, that I was no longer in control. I had given up. I had lost. The creature's power over me was absolute. The creature's gaze held me in its grip, suffocating, inescapable. As I stood frozen in place, unable to break free, something shifted. It was subtle at first, like a ripple in the air around me, but then it became more pronounced, visions, memories, fragments of thoughts that I couldn't place. At first, I thought they were just fleeting impressions, the result of my mind unraveling under the pressure of its eyes. But then they became clearer, sharper, so real that they almost felt like waking moments, like I had stepped out of my own body and into someone else's life. I saw my childhood home, the old brick house with the oak tree in the front yard. I was standing in the yard, looking up at the sun-dappled leaves. It was a memory I hadn't thought of in years, and it felt so real, so vivid, that I almost reached out to touch the air around me, expecting to feel the warm breeze of a summer afternoon. Then, as quickly as the memory appeared, it shifted. The sun faded, and I was back in the desert, but now the land was different. The sand had turned a pale, ghostly white, and the sky was a deep, oppressive red. The heat was unbearable, suffocating. I looked around and saw figures moving through the haze of the desert, a group of people, their faces twisted in pain, their eyes wide with terror. They were all looking at me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The scene flickered like an old film reel, then shifted again, this time to something more personal, more intimate. I saw myself, but it wasn't a man standing in the desert. This version of me was younger, wearing a different shirt, smiling as I sat in a cafe with a woman I once knew. We were laughing, our fingers brushing over the rim of our coffee cups. I hadn't thought of her in years. The memory was so warm, so alive, that I felt the tenderness of that moment again, a softness that was so stark against the cold, harsh reality of the desert. I didn't want to look away from it. I didn't want to break the illusion, this image of happiness, of life before everything had gone wrong. The creature's eyes held me captive, and I was powerless to resist the pull of these visions. Each memory, each scene, seemed to coax me deeper into its web, urging me to stay, to remain here, in this place that was not real but felt more real than anything else. As the vision of the woman faded, another memory took its place. This time, it was darker, more terrifying. I saw a shadow creeping across the hallway of my apartment at night. The silhouette of a figure, not quite human, moving toward me. I could feel the fear in my chest, my heart pounding in time with the thudding footsteps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The shadow reached out, its hand stretching toward me, and just as it touched my skin, everything went black. The desert swirled around me, the ground shifting beneath my feet as if reality itself was warping. The visions were relentless, each one more vivid than the last. Faces, places, moments from my life that I had long buried. They all mixed together, creating a tangled web of memory and illusion. I could barely tell where one ended and the other began. And with each new image, I felt the pull to stay grow stronger. The creature's eyes, glowing with a hypnotic golden light, seemed to feed off my confusion, my fear. It wasn't just controlling my body anymore, it was digging into my very soul, making me question what was real, what was true. I saw myself walking through the halls of a hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I was holding a small box, wrapped in paper, the ribbon tied tightly. The memory was suffocating, heavy with an unspoken grief. It was the day my father died. The day I'd been told I was too late. The memory flashed with such clarity, such force, that I almost dropped to my knees. I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to feel that pain again. But the creature's power was too much, its influence too strong. It fed on my despair, on my loss. The memories flickered one last time, and suddenly, I was standing in a dark, empty room. No light. No sound. Only the creature's eyes, burning into mine, compelling me to stay. To stay here in this place of illusions, where the world could be whatever I wanted it to be. Where I could escape from the pain, the fear, the loneliness. For a brief, fleeting moment, I almost gave in. It was so tempting to let go, to remain in this world of memories, of visions, where everything was soft and manageable. But then, something inside me stirred, a small, desperate flicker of resistance. This isn't real. None of this is real. But the thought was weak, drowning beneath the weight of the creature's hypnotic power. And yet, somehow, I could feel a sliver of awareness, a part of me that knew I had to fight. I had to break free. But how? How could I fight something that controlled not just my body, but my mind, my very thoughts? I took a shaky breath, trying to focus, trying to hold on to the fading fragments of reality, but the illusion was relentless. It wanted me to stay, to lose myself in its web. And I was starting to wonder if it was too late to escape. I could feel it now, clearer than ever before. The creature wasn't just controlling my body. No, it was much worse than that. It was twisting my mind, infiltrating my thoughts, bending my emotions to its will. The memories, the visions, it wasn't just an illusion. It was manipulating everything I felt, every reaction, and with each passing moment, it was pushing me further from reality. I tried to focus, to think clearly, but it was impossible. The thoughts I had once held firmly were slipping through my fingers like sand. I could feel my grip on myself loosening, as if the creature was reaching into my chest and squeezing my very soul, pulling it out, forcing it into something I didn't recognize. A wave of despair hit me, thick and suffocating. For a brief moment, I thought about all the things I had lost, my friends, my family, the life I had before all this. But the thought was fleeting, overtaken by a wave of strange comfort. It was as though the creature was feeding me my own sorrow, wrapping it around me like a blanket, coaxing me into its grip. Stay with it, the thought whispered. Stay here. Forget everything else. You don't need to fight anymore. It was so tempting. I wanted to let go. To let the desert, the creature, and the illusions carry me away into this false peace. But then something in the back of my mind screamed, no! This is wrong. This isn't real. I had to hold on. I had to remember who I was. But how could I, when the creature was clouding my thoughts, erasing my memories, distorting my reality? I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and when my eyes opened again, the desert around me had changed. The sky had darkened, the sand turned an unnatural shade of gray, and the once distant hum of the wind now sounded like a low growl. I could hear it echoing through the silence, wrapping around me like a warning. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I tried to take a step back, but my body refused to listen. The sand beneath my feet felt heavier, as if it was trying to pull me down. It was like walking through quicksand, each step a struggle against an invisible force that wanted to drag me under. And then, as I struggled to move, I heard it again, an almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustle of leaves, but this time it wasn't the wind. The whisper was coming from the creature itself. Give in. There's no point in fighting. You're already mine. It was like a voice in my head, but not my own. It was dark, deep, and ancient, filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. It was speaking directly to my mind, feeding on my fear, my confusion. The creature was no longer just a predator, it had become my thoughts, my emotions, twisting them into something unrecognizable. I tried to shake my head, to break free, but each movement felt sluggish, as if my body had become foreign to me. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt in control. Everything was slipping away, like a dream fading into the ether. But it wasn't a dream. This was real. The fear, the suffocating pressure, the hallucinations, all of it was real. I stumbled forward, my feet dragging through the sand, and the creature loomed closer. Its form seemed to shimmer in the air, flickering like a mirage, but its eyes, those burning eyes, were always there. They were pulling me in, deep into their core, and I couldn't look away. Every second I stared, I felt my own sense of self begin to disintegrate, fading like a shadow in the sun. You are nothing, it whispered again, its voice like ice. You were never meant to be anything more. You were always mine, from the moment you set foot in my domain. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It was true. There was no escape. I wasn't just lost in the desert. I was lost within myself, my mind unraveling under the weight of the creature's influence. The fear, the confusion, the terror, it was all part of its game. It was breaking me down, piece by piece, until I was nothing but a hollow shell, ready to be consumed. And yet, somewhere deep inside me, there was still a flicker of defiance. A small, fragile part of me that refused to be consumed. I won't give up, I thought, my mind screaming against the encroaching darkness. I can fight this. But how? How could I fight something that wasn't just a creature of flesh and bone, but a force that could penetrate my very thoughts, my deepest fears? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, but the air was thick, stifling. Every breath felt like I was inhaling fire. The creature's presence grew stronger, more suffocating. And then, suddenly, the visions returned. But this time, they weren't just memories. They were taunts. I saw myself again, this time walking through an empty street, alone. The familiar city skyline was shrouded in mist, the buildings looming like dark, oppressive giants. And in the distance, I saw a figure standing, waiting. It was her, the woman from my memories. But this time, she wasn't smiling. Her eyes were wide, empty, hollow. She reached out to me, her lips moving, but no sound came out. She was calling me to join her. Come to me, the creature whispered. We are waiting for you. And with that, I realized the horrifying truth. The creature wasn't just controlling me. It was feeding on my loneliness, my deepest, most vulnerable emotions. It had been waiting for this moment, for me to break. It wasn't just trying to kill me, it was trying to erase me, to make me forget who I was and become something else. Something that belonged to it. The panic surged again, louder now, as I fought with everything I had left. I had to get out. I had to escape. I couldn't let it take me. But with each passing second, I felt myself slipping further, my thoughts no longer my own. The creature was winning, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. Panic surged through me like a burst of electricity, jolting me back into reality, or what felt like reality. I can't stay here. I can't let it take me. The voice of the creature whispered relentlessly in my mind, but there was something, some fragile thread of resistance left inside me. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on, but I had to try. I had to break free. I tore my gaze away from the creature's hypnotic eyes, forcing my eyes to look at anything but those glowing, unblinking pupils. My vision blurred, but I didn't care. I couldn't think about the desert, the sand, or the creature. I had to escape. I had to move. I turned and ran. My legs felt like lead, my feet dragging through the thick, hot sand. The weight of my body, the exhaustion from the constant struggle, every step felt like I was running through quicksand. My lungs burned with each breath, the air dry and oppressive. It was hard to focus, hard to breathe, but I forced my legs to move faster, harder. Don't look back. Don't look back. But I could feel it. The presence. It was there, even if I didn't see it. The creature was still watching me, and I could sense it, like a shadow creeping up behind me, gaining on me with every second. The hypnotic pull was still there, tugging at my mind, trying to draw me back. Come back. There's nowhere to go. You can't escape. I stumbled, my foot catching on an unseen rock, and I fell hard onto the ground. The impact rattled my bones, but I didn't have time to process the pain. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, my mind a blur. I had to keep moving. I had to. But as I pushed myself upright, my head swam, and the world around me seemed to shift. The ground tilted, and I almost fell again. My vision flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was losing my balance, losing my mind. No, no, no! I fought against the dizziness, trying to steady myself, but it felt like the earth was tilting beneath me, the very desert itself bending and warping. I had to push forward. I had to keep running. But the further I ran, the more lost I felt. I didn't know where I was. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a vast, empty expanse that swallowed me whole. The sand was the same in every direction, the horizon a distant, unreachable line. My head spun as I tried to focus on anything that would tell me I was going the right way. But there was nothing. No sign of life, no landmarks to guide me. The creature was still there, always there, its presence hanging in the air like a weight on my chest. I could feel it following me, its eyes burning into the back of my skull, its influence creeping through my thoughts, breaking down my resolve. Why are you running? There's no point. You can't outrun me. The whisper in my mind grew louder, and I could feel my body slowing down, my movements sluggish. Every step felt heavier than the last, my legs trembling, my arms feeling as if they weighed a ton. I was too tired, too exhausted to fight. I couldn't keep running like this. The desert was closing in on me, and I couldn't find a way out. I tried to shake my head, to clear the fog in my mind, but it was like trying to move through water. The pull of the creature's power was growing stronger. The memories, the visions, the emotions, it was all mixing together, blurring into one overwhelming flood of confusion and despair. I staggered to a stop, gasping for breath. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes, but I couldn't wipe it away. My hands were shaking, my chest tightening with fear. I could feel the creature's influence closing in, wrapping around me like chains. My thoughts felt like they were slipping away again, as if the desert was swallowing them whole. I closed my eyes for a moment, just a brief moment, trying to steady myself. The darkness behind my eyelids felt like a comfort, like I could hide from the creature, from everything, if only I could rest. But I knew better. I couldn't let myself slip again. I couldn't give in. Keep going, I told myself. Don't stop. Don't give up. But the world around me was shifting. I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, behind me. They were coming closer, and every step sounded like thunder in my ears. My heart raced, but when I turned to look, I saw nothing. The desert was still. Silent. Empty. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, feel the presence closing in. The creature's influence was stronger than ever. And I realized, with growing horror, that I wasn't just losing my mind. I wasn't just being chased by some beast in the desert. The creature was controlling me. It was manipulating my thoughts, my actions. And there was nowhere to run. I was trapped. I ran. The sand beneath my feet burned like fire, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even feel the pain anymore. The only thing that mattered was moving away from the thing chasing me, the thing that was closing in relentlessly. With each step, my breath came faster, more shallow. My chest burned as if the air itself was trying to choke me, but I couldn't let up. The beast, the lizard, I thought, was behind me, its presence like a heavy weight on my back, its eyes never leaving me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but I felt it. Its shadow stretched across the desert, growing longer, nearer. I tried to push through the dizziness, the fear that clawed at my mind. I thought I heard it again, those footsteps. Slow, methodical, but getting closer with every moment. I whipped my head around, my heart hammering, but there was still nothing. The desert stretched on in every direction, empty and vast, but I knew I wasn't alone. I can't outrun it, I thought. I can't outrun something that isn't even here, not in the way I think. But the very thought made my pulse quicken, the terror seizing me with fresh intensity. There was no logic in this. No rational explanation. Every muscle in my body screamed to keep going, but my mind was failing me. Was I still running in the right direction? Was I moving towards safety or into a deeper nightmare? I stumbled again, the sand uneven beneath my feet, but I caught myself. A flash of something, a movement, caught my eye in the distance, a flicker of motion that was there one moment and gone the next. My pulse spiked, and I fought to control my breath, refusing to let panic take over. It was close. I had no proof, no reason to believe I wasn't imagining it, but I could feel it. That presence. That heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to move in time with my own frantic steps. The lizard. It was right there. Right behind me. Every time I turned a corner, I swore it was closer. The air around me seemed to distort, the heat of the desert warping the horizon, making it impossible to tell how much ground I was actually covering. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the sand, but it only made everything worse. The shifting light made the world feel unreal, dreamlike, like I was running in some kind of distorted reality where escape was impossible. Focus, I thought, forcing myself to stop for a moment. I had to keep control. I couldn't afford to let my mind wander. I had to keep moving, keep going forward, keep fighting the compulsion to look back, to see it. The silence of the desert had become oppressive, filling my ears with its suffocating weight. I could feel my body slowing down, my legs shaking beneath me, my strength draining with every step. But the creature, it didn't tire. It never did. I turned to glance over my shoulder again, the hair on the back of my neck prickling with the sensation that I was being watched, stalked. There was nothing. The desert stretched on, empty. But I knew it was there. I could feel its eyes boring into me. I started to run faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the exhaustion almost unbearable. I had to get away. I had to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, it felt like the creature was still there, just behind me, always within reach. The sounds, the whispers in my mind, the scrape of claws against the sand, the slow, rhythmic footsteps, it was all too much. The desert was closing in on me. I was being hunted. The creature had no need for speed, no need for urgency. It was patient. It was waiting for me to exhaust myself, to break. And I was getting close. The darkness of the desert night was beginning to creep over the horizon, and with it came a new wave of dread. The air was cooling, but the fear only intensified. I knew that the longer I ran, the harder it would be to stay focused, to keep my wits about me. Stay sharp. Don't stop. I tried to force the words into my mind, but the exhaustion was suffocating. The energy I had left was slipping away, leaving only raw, paralyzing terror in its wake. I glanced over my shoulder again, heart pounding in my chest. And there it was. A shape, just beyond the edge of my vision, a shadow stretching longer and darker than the rest. I couldn't make out its form completely, but I knew. It was the lizard. Closer. Closer. The chase had begun. I stopped running. It was a moment of pure instinct, my body frozen mid-stride, my mind screaming at me to turn around and keep going, but my legs just wouldn't move. I had no choice now. The desert had become an endless, suffocating void, and there was no escaping it. There was no escape from it. I felt the air shift, heavy and thick with tension. The temperature dropped, a cold chill sweeping over the desert in stark contrast to the scorching heat I had been running in moments before. I looked around, my eyes darting in every direction, searching for any sign of movement, any sign that it was close. The sand was still. The horizon, as always, stretched out endlessly before me. And then I heard it. A faint sound, almost too quiet to be real, a scratching, scraping noise, like claws dragging across rock. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. Closer. There was no mistaking it now. The lizard was here. I slowly turned, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. It was standing there, not 10 feet away. The air around it shimmered, the heat rippling, making it look like some mirage. The creature was enormous. Its scales glistened in the fading light, each one a different shade of dark, iridescent green, gleaming like wet stone. Its eyes, those eyes, were hypnotic, glowing faintly, like two twin orbs of fire. They were locked on me, and I could feel them in my very bones, pulling at my will. For a long moment, neither of us moved. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting. My hands were shaking, my body frozen in place, but I couldn't look away. I had to make it move. I had to do something. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat almost unbearable, and took a step back. The creature's head tilted slightly, its eyes narrowing, and that was all it took for the fear to surge back up, washing over me like a cold wave. I had never felt more alone in my life. With a sudden burst of desperation, I shouted at it, "Go away! Leave me alone!" My voice cracked, the words barely escaping my mouth. But I couldn't let it stop there. I stepped forward, fists clenched, trying to make myself look bigger, trying to project confidence, to intimidate it. I said, "Go away." It didn't flinch. The lizard just stood there, as if waiting. I reached down, grabbing a nearby rock, and hurled it at the creature. It sailed through the air, spinning toward it with all the strength I could muster. The rock hit the ground a few feet short, sending up a cloud of sand, but the lizard didn't even move. Its eyes never left mine. I cursed, grabbing another rock, throwing it with all my might, but this time the creature flinched. It didn't retreat, but there was a brief flicker of movement. Its head jerked slightly, and its massive tail twitched. And then it moved closer. The speed was unreal. One moment it was standing still, and in the next, it was only a few feet away, its massive body propelling forward with terrifying precision. I stumbled backward, my heart leaping into my throat as I tried to put distance between us. But it was faster. It was everywhere. The world around me seemed to close in, the air thick with its presence. It's too fast. It's too strong. I could feel my breath coming faster now, my mind spinning, trying to find a way out, a way to stop it. The more I thought about escaping, the more I realized that this was it. This was the end. The lizard opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, its breath hot and rancid as it growled, low and guttural. I could feel the ground shake with the sound, and my legs gave out beneath me. No, no, no! I scrambled backward, trying to get away, but my back hit something hard. I turned, desperate to find an escape, but there was nothing. The desert had become a trap, and I was caught in it. The creature's gaze never wavered. Its eyes bored into mine, pulling me in deeper with every second. I could feel its influence again, tugging at the edges of my consciousness, trying to take control. My mind screamed for me to look away, to break free from its hold, but I couldn't. I couldn't. And then, with a roar, it lunged. I didn't have time to react. The creature's jaws snapped shut just inches from my face, the force of the strike sending a shockwave through my body, knocking the air from my lungs. I fell backward, my heart racing as the ground beneath me seemed to crumble away. I was no longer just afraid. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the sheer power of its gaze. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in its web, its influence wrapping tighter and tighter around me. This is it. The thought repeated in my mind like a mantra. But as I lay there, with the creature looming over me, I knew that something had shifted. There was no fighting it anymore. I wasn't just running from it. I was running from myself, from the very part of me that was slipping away, losing control. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, trying to block out the suffocating presence of the creature. But the moment I did, everything seemed to shift. The air around me wavered like a mirage, distorting the world in ways I couldn't understand. I felt a pull, a tug in my chest, urging me to look again. When I opened my eyes, the creature was no longer directly in front of me. Instead, I saw it everywhere. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the shape was there. In the corner of my eye, its massive, glowing eyes were fixed on me from the rocks. In the shadows cast by the distant, twisted cacti, I saw its massive body moving, undulating like a living shadow, its claws scraping across the earth. It wasn't just in front of me now, it was all around me. Changing, shifting, multiplying. The lizard's form seemed to stretch, grow, shrink, becoming something I could never quite grasp. Its enormous body twisted and contorted, as though it was in multiple places at once, each more grotesque than the last. One moment it was a shadow stretching along the ground, just a silhouette against the desert sands. The next, it was towering over me, its head just inches from mine, breathing hot, rancid air into my face. I stumbled back, my body trembling with terror, but each time I tried to move, the creature's form warped again, splitting, multiplying. The sand beneath my feet shifted, the desert stretching and contorting as though it was a vast, endless labyrinth. And the eyes were always there, staring into me, through me, filling my mind with their hypnotic pull. I reached out to steady myself against a rock, but when I touched it, the texture of the stone seemed to melt away. It wasn't solid, it wasn't real. The whole world around me was no longer real. Everything had turned into something strange, something alien. The rocks were no longer rocks, they were just shifting shapes, warped into grotesque, jagged silhouettes. The air, the sand, the ground beneath me, it all felt like it was slipping away. Was it the creature's power? Was it its doing? The world around me twisted further, more and more distorting with every passing second. I saw the lizard now, no longer just a singular beast, but an army of them, each one crawling over the dunes, skittering across the sand like cockroaches, their eyes glowing from every shadow, from every corner of my vision. I tried to focus, to tell myself it wasn't real. But the longer I stared, the harder it was to distinguish what was real and what wasn't. The air shimmered like heat rising from the ground, making everything appear as if it was moving, breathing, alive. In the distance, I saw the creature again, its form stretching and warping into something I couldn't quite define. It grew bigger, taller, an impossible size, until it loomed over me like a mountain, blocking out the sun. And then, in an instant, it shrank, morphing back to its original form, then splitting again into multiple figures, multiplying until they covered the entire desert. I staggered back, my heart racing, sweat pouring down my face. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like stone. It was as though the very landscape was closing in on me, surrounding me with these ever-changing monsters, this endless, shifting nightmare. How could I fight something that was everywhere? How could I escape it when it was both real and not real all at once? It's all in my head, I tried to tell myself. It's just an illusion. It's the creature messing with me. It's trying to break me. But the more I told myself that, the more the illusion seemed to hold. The lizard wasn't just outside of me anymore. It was inside me, crawling through my thoughts, twisting my mind until I couldn't tell what was imagined and what was real. The line between the two blurred until there was no difference. I felt a cold wave wash over me, chilling me to the bone. The desert, the sun, the very air around me, everything had become alien, hostile, suffocating. The longer I stood there, the more I saw its eyes everywhere, staring from the sand, from the sky, from the very stones beneath my feet. I couldn't escape. I couldn't outrun it. I reached out again, grasping for something solid, but it was like grabbing at smoke. My vision spun, each breath more labored than the last. The shape of the creature was everywhere, no longer just one, but many, a swarm of them crawling across the landscape, surrounding me. Where am I? I couldn't answer. The desert, the world, everything had melted away into chaos, into madness. I was lost. Not just in the desert, but in my own mind, trapped in this illusion the creature had crafted. It was toying with me now, playing with my sanity, my perception of reality. Everywhere I looked, I saw its eyes, glowing in the shifting shadows. The more I looked, the worse it became. And then, in the distance, I saw it again. Its form grew larger, its presence stronger, until the very world seemed to bend around it. This time, I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. No place where I could hide. The lizard had taken control of my mind, and now it was taking control of my world. The desert air felt thick as I stumbled, desperate to find something, anything, to give me a moment of respite. The ground shifted beneath my feet, each step making my legs feel heavier, more unsteady. My mind was in chaos, spinning between reality and the illusion of the lizard's influence. I had to get away. I had to escape. Somehow, through the haze of fear and confusion, my eyes locked on a narrow gap between two large rocks up ahead. It wasn't much, but it was a way out, a small sliver of hope, a chance to hide. I wasn't thinking anymore. My body just moved on instinct, driven by the primal need to survive. The sound of my heartbeat thundered in my ears, louder than my breath, louder than the shifting, scraping sounds of the creature that was always just behind me. But I pushed forward. I didn't stop. I reached the gap. It was tight, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but I didn't care. I squeezed through, the jagged edges of the rocks scraping my skin, but I didn't feel it. I didn't feel anything except the crushing weight of fear pressing down on me. I made it through. The gap opened up into a small, narrow crevice, wedged between the cliffs. It was dark, shadowed by the looming rocks above, and I felt a brief flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe, just maybe, the lizard couldn't follow me here. I had found a place it couldn't reach. But I wasn't safe yet. Not really. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, my breath ragged, my eyes wide, scanning every corner, every crack in the rock. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the creature's presence was still there, surrounding me, even if I couldn't see it. It was everywhere. It had to be. I tried to steady my breathing, desperate to remain calm. But the more I focused, the more I thought I could hear it, the soft scraping sound, the claws skittering across the earth, getting closer. My heart raced again, and I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see it slithering through the rocks, its eyes glowing, its massive form looming over me. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence was deafening, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong, like the world around me was holding its breath. The gap I had found might have been small, but in this moment, it felt like the entire desert had collapsed in on me. Like the rocks were closing in, trapping me in this dark crevice. I slid down the wall of the narrow passage, trying to make myself as small as possible, my knees drawn up to my chest. The air felt thick with dread, heavy and oppressive, and I couldn't escape it. The creature's presence still loomed over me, no longer just in my mind, but in the very fabric of the space around me. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every noise seemed amplified, distorted. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound of my own racing thoughts. But the deeper I sank into the darkness of the narrow pass, the more it felt like I was sinking into my own fear, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to stay as still as possible, but every time I looked up, I expected to see its glowing eyes staring back at me. It couldn't have gotten this far. Not yet. There was no way it could follow me into this crevice, into this narrow space. I glanced up toward the narrow opening I had crawled through. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert. My pulse throbbed in my temples, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. What if it was waiting? What if it could somehow find me? The thought paralyzed me. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed in a suffocating silence. The air felt thick with tension, every breath heavy, every movement forced. The shadows pressed in on me, the walls seemed to close in tighter, and I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being smothered by this place, by the creature's influence. But as time stretched on, I began to wonder, was I truly safe? Or had I simply given the creature a new place to corner me, a place where it could draw me into its control without me even realizing? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the fear. I had to focus. I couldn't let my mind play tricks on me. But then I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, so faint it could have been my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. It came from behind me, from the entrance of the passage, as if something had just shifted, something large. I couldn't look. I couldn't. My body refused to move, frozen in place. The sound came again, a low, scraping noise, just on the edge of my hearing. The lizard wasn't gone. It was waiting. And just like that, I understood there was no place for me to hide. No matter how small, how tight, how isolated the space, it could always find me. The walls of this crevice were no protection. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. The air inside the crevice was thick and heavy, but for a moment it felt calmer. The scraping sounds had stopped. The frantic buzzing of my mind, the relentless pounding of my heart, everything seemed to slow, just for a brief second. I let out a shaky breath, feeling my body relax, almost as if the world outside had disappeared entirely. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to close my eyes. The silence, though unnerving, was a comfort I hadn't realized I craved. The shadows around me seemed to hold me, wrapping me in a false sense of security, as though I could simply rest here, hidden away from the nightmare that had been stalking me. It was as if the creature had given up. It hadn't followed me into this narrow space, and I hadn't heard it for a while. For just a moment, I entertained the possibility that I might have escaped. That I might have found a refuge, a place where it couldn't reach me. But the calm, the stillness, it felt wrong. It felt too quiet. I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that the silence wasn't a sign of safety, but of something else entirely. Something worse. The lizard, I realized, had been stalking me this whole time, its presence hanging over me, always just out of sight. Its eyes had never left me. The brief respite I was feeling was nothing but an illusion, a lull in the storm. I leaned against the rock, my back pressing hard against the cold stone, but there was no comfort in it. A chill crept over my skin, creeping up from the soles of my feet, winding its way through my veins until I felt it in my chest. My breath quickened again, despite myself. It knows. I didn't need to see it, didn't need to hear it. The very thought felt like a cold hand wrapped around my throat. The lizard, this creature, whatever it was aware of where I was. It didn't need to search for me. It knew. For the first time, I understood the true nature of its power. The way it could make me see things that weren't there, the way it twisted my perception. It had always been one step ahead, always watching, always present, even when I couldn't feel it. It had been waiting for me to think I was safe. Waiting for me to lower my guard. I pressed my palms against my face, trying to stifle the panic rising in my chest. My fingers dug into my skin as if I could somehow wake up from this nightmare. But I wasn't asleep. This wasn't a dream. This was real. And the creature was real. It was always with me, always hovering just beyond my reach, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The sensation of being watched intensified. It felt like the walls of the crevice were closing in, like the desert itself was moving, reshaping around me. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It wasn't a sign of safety. It was the calm before the storm. The creature was coming. I could almost feel it in the air, the pressure building, like the world was holding its breath. And then, the soft scrape of claws on stone reached my ears again, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was close. So close. My blood ran cold. I pressed myself back into the crevice, wishing I could make myself invisible. My body trembled as I strained to hear, to make sense of the faint noises that were slowly growing louder. It's here. It's here. The sound was getting closer, circling around me like a predator hunting its prey. Each scrape of its claws was like a countdown, reminding me that I was not alone, not safe, not even hidden. The lizard knew. And it was coming for me. I closed my eyes again, the terror suffocating me. There was no escape. There never had been. The creature would always find me, no matter where I ran, no matter how deep I hid. It was a part of this place, a force I couldn't fight or outrun. And all I could do was wait, trapped in this moment of silence before the inevitable storm. I wasn't alone. I would never be alone again. The lizard was waiting, and so was I. The silence in the crevice felt suffocating, pressing on me from every angle, as if the very air itself was a tangible force, bearing down with relentless pressure. My mind spun in a whirlpool of confusion. I tried to focus, tried to calm my thoughts, but every moment spent alone in this narrow space seemed to pull me deeper into an abyss of doubt. Was this really happening? Or was it all in my head? I had to be losing my mind. This couldn't be real. None of it made sense. The lizard, the strange sounds, the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, it was all so absurd. I had come here to enjoy a hike, to escape the mundane. And now I was trapped in this nightmare. A part of me wanted to believe it was all just a figment of my imagination. I had been alone in the desert too long, I told myself. The isolation, the heat, the exhaustion, it was all playing tricks on me. I could almost hear my own voice in my head, repeating over and over, "It's just the sun, it's just the wind, it's just your tired mind." But even as I tried to convince myself of this, something gnawed at the back of my mind. It wasn't just the fatigue or the desert heat that made me feel this way. It was the presence. The feeling that I was never alone, that someone was always watching, waiting. Even when I closed my eyes, it was there, lurking in the corners of my thoughts. I shifted uneasily, trying to clear my mind, but every time I tried to focus, I saw flashes, images that made no sense. The lizard's eyes, gleaming like pools of molten gold, staring at me from the shadows. Its long, clawed fingers twitching in anticipation. And then, nothing. Just an empty, suffocating silence. I began to wonder if I was imagining it all. Was it really the lizard watching me? Or was it just my mind breaking under the weight of fear? I drew in a sharp breath, my hands trembling as I pressed them against my face. No, this couldn't be just in my head. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The footsteps in the sand. The shadows that shifted when I wasn't looking. The cold, unnerving sensation of being followed. I had heard it, felt it, and yet, now, it all seemed so far away, so impossible. Am I losing my mind? I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the images to stop. But they kept coming, swirling around me like a never-ending tide. My body shook as the panic surged once more. I wanted to run, to get out of here, to escape this nightmare, but the thought of leaving the relative safety of the crevice paralyzed me. I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. The longer I stayed in this dark, isolated space, the more I began to wonder if I was the only real thing left. What if everything I had seen, the lizard, the sounds, the unease, was nothing more than a hallucination, a product of my unraveling sanity? But then, a sound broke through the chaos in my mind. A subtle scraping, the faintest rustling that echoed through the crevice. It wasn't much. Just a whisper of sound, barely noticeable. But it was there. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. No, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was just my mind playing tricks. It had to be. I turned my head, trying to peer through the narrow opening at the edge of the passage. Nothing. Just the empty, shadowed desert. But the sound, the scrape of claws on stone, was louder now, unmistakable. It's real. It's here. I pressed my back harder against the wall, squeezing my eyes shut, willing the world to disappear. But it didn't. The presence was there, pressing in on me, suffocating me. My breathing quickened as my thoughts spiraled faster, spinning away from me like a runaway train. What if it's not in my mind? What if it's not a hallucination? What if it's real? The terror clawed in my chest as I started to unravel. My thoughts began to blur together, merging into a haze of confusion. Was I still in control of my mind, or had I crossed some line, some point of no return? The walls of the crevice closed in, the shadows seemed to grow darker, and I was left wondering, helplessly, if the lizard was already inside my mind, if it had always been there, manipulating my thoughts, pulling the strings without me realizing it. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I wasn't sure if I even cared. The scraping sound had faded into the background, but the pressure in my chest remained. I tried to focus on my breathing, to steady my thoughts, but my mind refused to cooperate. Instead, memories began to surface, unbidden, rising like dark clouds from the depths of my consciousness. I hadn't thought about those memories in years, decades, maybe. I had buried them deep, locked away in the dusty corners of my mind, too afraid to confront them. But now, in the isolation of this desolate desert, they had resurfaced with a vengeance. I saw myself as a child, standing in the corner of my old bedroom, the shadows stretching long across the walls. The fear had been so real back then, so all-consuming. I could feel it again now, crawling beneath my skin, just as it had all those years ago. The coldness in the room, the way the shadows moved as if they had a life of their own, and the feeling that something was always watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. At night, I would pull the covers over my head, convinced that if I couldn't see it, whatever it was couldn't see me. But the feeling of being watched never left. It followed me into my dreams, turning them into twisted nightmares. I could still remember the whispers, soft and low, just out of reach of my understanding, but enough to make my heart race with fear. I had convinced myself that those fears were just the product of an overactive imagination, that they were simply childhood fantasies. But now, sitting here, alone in the dark crevice of the desert, the memories came rushing back, and with them, a sickening realization. The creature, the lizard, It was always there, always watching. Had it been watching me all these years, even when I didn't know? Was it that same presence, the one that haunted my childhood nightmares, the one that made me lock every door and peer nervously out the window at night? It had been waiting for me, just like before. The cold grip of terror tightened around my chest as I recalled the strange dreams I had as a child, the ones where I was pursued by an enormous, shadowy creature with gleaming eyes that stared deep into my soul. I had thought they were just dreams, just my mind playing tricks. But now, with everything that had happened to me in the desert, I began to wonder if those dreams were more than just figments of my imagination. Had I seen it before? Had it always been there, lurking just out of sight, shaping my fears, my nightmares? Had it been with me all along? I remembered the way the shadows had moved in my room as a child, the way they seemed to stretch and twist into impossible shapes. I remembered the whispers that had been so faint, yet somehow so clear. And now, in the midst of the desert, I could hear them again, not in the wind, but inside my mind. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, their tones melodic and soothing, like a lullaby meant to lull me into submission. The connection between my childhood fears and the creature stalking me now was undeniable. The same feeling of being watched, the same unease that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. It was as though my whole life had led to this moment, this confrontation with something ancient, something that existed long before I had ever been born. Something that had been waiting for me, perhaps even shaping my fears over the years, drawing me to this desert, this isolated place. I tried to shake the thoughts away, but they clung to me like a heavy fog, suffocating any semblance of rational thought. Was this all just a twisted extension of my childhood fears, or was I truly being hunted by something far worse? The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I was left in the dark, unsure of what was real and what was simply a projection of my broken mind. The memories kept coming, faster now, like an unstoppable flood, overwhelming me with their intensity. I saw myself as a child, terrified and alone, trapped in a world that felt both too large and too small. And then, I saw the lizard, just a shadow at first, but growing larger, more menacing, as though it had always been there, hidden in the dark corners of my life. Was it the same creature? Had it always been this way? I could no longer distinguish between the child I once was and the man I had become. The fears, the memories, the shadows, they all mixed together into something unrecognizable. It was as if my entire existence had been leading me to this point, to this moment in the desert, where I was faced with something so old, so primal, that I couldn't even comprehend it. The memories gnawed at my sanity, twisting and warping until I couldn't tell where the past ended and the present began. And in the middle of it all, the creature, the lizard, stood still, watching me, waiting for me to break. I had no way of knowing if the nightmare would ever end. I only knew that I could never escape it. The darkness around me seemed to pulse, to breathe, as I sat trembling in the narrow crevice. Every nerve in my body felt taut, strung out on the thin thread of fear, as if I might snap at any moment. My mind, already a jumble of confusion, began to fracture even further, splintering into pieces. And as it did, one thing remained constant: the eyes. I could see them even with my eyes closed. The lizard's eyes, wide and unblinking, gleaming with a golden, hypnotic glow that pierced through the darkness of my thoughts. They weren't just in the shadows anymore. They had invaded my mind, pushing aside every coherent thought, every rational explanation. It was as though they had become the center of my existence, and I, the helpless observer, was bound to their gaze. I couldn't stop seeing them. I couldn't escape them. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, desperate to block out the vision, but it only intensified. The lizard's eyes, Those gleaming, endless pools of gold seemed to follow me, moving behind my eyelids, pushing through the very fabric of my thoughts. They were everywhere. I could feel them, deep in the recesses of my mind, whispering without sound, pulling at me, guiding me. Look at me. The thought came, not in words, but in a feeling, compelling, irresistible. I felt an almost unbearable pull, as if my very essence was being drawn toward those eyes, toward the creature that had once seemed so distant, so unreal. But now, it was here, inside me, in every thought I had. I was losing myself. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and erratic as I tried to resist, tried to push back against the invisible weight that was pressing down on me. But it was no use. The lizard's presence, its power, was too strong. I had no choice but to submit, to give in to the force that was slowly consuming me from the inside out. I reached up, my hands trembling, as though I could somehow claw the thoughts out of my head. But even my own body felt distant, as though it were no longer fully mine to command. My fingers grazed my face, my neck, and for a moment I thought I felt the cold touch of something that wasn't my own skin, a creeping sensation, like the scaly touch of the lizard itself, sliding over me. I jerked back, but it was too late. I had already seen it. I had already felt it. The lizard's gaze filled my mind completely, every thought drowned beneath its weight. I could feel its presence, its eyes, even as I shut mine tightly against them. They were inside me now, weaving their way into my very thoughts, twisting and distorting them, making everything else fade away. The desert, the sun, the crevice, all of it was meaningless now. There was only the lizard. Only those eyes. The eyes that had taken me, that had slowly unraveled me, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than a puppet, strings pulled tight by an unseen force. The thoughts were no longer mine. I remembered the first time I had seen those eyes, distant in the desert sun. The same haunting, hypnotic pull had been there then, but it hadn't been as strong. I had resisted, or so I had thought. But now, in this crevice, isolated from everything, I realized that my resistance had been an illusion. The lizard had always been there, just below the surface, waiting for the right moment to take control. I wasn't even sure if I was still thinking for myself. Was I? Or had the lizard already won? Was my every movement, my every breath, a part of its plan? The silence in the crevice was oppressive, suffocating, yet it was also comforting. The emptiness around me seemed to mirror the emptiness inside my mind, as though the two were one. My own thoughts felt distant, detached from me, as if they no longer mattered. Only the lizard remained, its eyes locked on mine, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I felt my body relax, my mind drifting, as if I were floating in a vast, dark ocean. There was no more struggle. No more need to resist. It was over. The creature had won. And in that moment, I understood. It had never been about survival. It had never been about escaping. I had always been meant to fall into this, to succumb to its gaze. The lizard had only been waiting for me to break, to weaken enough for it to claim me. I had no control anymore. There was nothing left of me. Only the eyes, watching, waiting. And then, nothing. I tried to steady my breathing, to grasp at the last threads of rationality that were slipping through my fingers like sand. My mind screamed for clarity, for something, anything, that would make sense of the madness I was drowning in. But the lizard's eyes, those eyes, they never left me. They were always there, even when I shut my own. They were in my thoughts, pulling at my every desire, every impulse, until all I could think about was giving in. But I couldn't. I had to survive. I had to fight. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. I shook my head, desperate to push away the thoughts. I forced myself to sit up, trying to focus on something, anything, that could bring me back to the present, something tangible that could remind me of who I was, where I was, what I was supposed to be doing. Focus, damn it. The desert. I was in a desert, far from civilization, with nothing but barren land stretching endlessly in every direction. I had been hiking, trying to enjoy the silence, the solitude. I had planned to be out here for days, to get away from everything, to clear my head. But this thing, it had disrupted everything. I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled beneath me, as though they were no longer under my control. My heart raced, my skin prickled with cold sweat, and my thoughts, they were becoming fuzzier. Everything felt distant, as if I were watching it all from some faraway place, detached from my own body. The urge to lie back down, to close my eyes and drift into the quiet emptiness, was overwhelming. But I fought it. I had to fight it. I have to survive, I told myself again, my voice barely a whisper in my head. I am stronger than this. I am stronger than it. The creature. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it win. I thought of the world beyond this desert, the people I had left behind, friends, family, life. It wasn't just my life at stake anymore. If I let this thing take me, if I gave in, then everything I had ever known would be meaningless. But I could feel it, the pull. The weight of its presence, like a heavy chain around my chest. Its eyes, those eyes, had drilled into my soul, and now it was impossible to escape them. I staggered, forcing my legs to move, pushing my body forward as if my life depended on each step. And maybe it did. Every part of me screamed to stop, to surrender, but I couldn't. Not yet. Think. I begged myself. What is happening? I remembered the camera, the pictures I had found, the eyes. I remembered the strange, unexplainable feelings that had gnawed at me from the moment I stepped into this cursed place. It was all connected. The desert, the camera, the lizard. It was all part of some sick game, a trap designed to break me, to drive me into madness. But I wouldn't let it. I'm not crazy. This is real. I'm not insane. I just need to survive. I tried to ignore the voice that whispered in the back of my mind, the one that sounded like it belonged to the lizard itself, urging me to stop running, to accept my fate. But I couldn't let go of the belief that I had power over my own mind, my own actions. I had to believe that I could resist, that I could fight off whatever dark influence this creature held over me. Just keep moving. Keep going. Don't stop. But with each step, it became harder to ignore the cold, the darkness, the constant, oppressive pull of its eyes. They were with me, in my mind, in my thoughts, and they were growing stronger. My vision blurred, my body felt heavy, like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. I stumbled, falling to my knees. My breath came in short gasps as I looked around desperately, trying to regain some sense of direction. But there was nothing. Only the desert, stretching endlessly in every direction. I was completely alone. You can't run forever, the voice whispered, soft as silk, yet it cut through me like a blade. You will never escape. I have you now. It was so hard to think, so hard to keep my mind focused. The more I tried to fight, the weaker I became. The will to survive, to hold on to the last remnants of my sanity, was slipping through my fingers. I looked up at the sky, trying to find something, anything real, something that could ground me. But the sky was just a vast, empty void, stretching infinitely above me, and the weight on my chest grew heavier. I have to survive. I have to keep going. But my thoughts were fading, consumed by the ever-present force that surrounded me. The fight was draining from me, piece by piece. The creature's influence was seeping into every fiber of my being, and no matter how hard I struggled, no matter how loudly I screamed in my mind to wake up, I was losing. And with that, the final shred of resistance disappeared. I had stopped moving. I couldn't remember when it had happened, but the moment I ceased to fight, when I finally let go of everything, I was overcome by a strange stillness. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. And yet, everything had changed. I sat in the sand, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the desert. The sky above me seemed to swirl, a shifting, liquid mass of color and shadow. The ground beneath me felt soft and unsteady, like I was sinking into it, my body slowly melting with the earth, becoming one with it. But then I realized that it wasn't the earth that was shifting, it was my mind. Is this real? The question lingered in my thoughts, repeating over and over, but there was no answer. My surroundings had dissolved into something other. The air was thick, like it was made of smoke, swirling and twisting around me. I could hear the wind, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt like whispers, soft voices, beckoning to me from far away. The eyes were there again. Always there. I tried to look away, to focus on something, anything, that wasn't those damn eyes, but they followed me. No matter where I turned, they were there. Watching. Waiting. It was as if the very air itself had become their presence. Even the ground beneath me felt like it was made of eyes. I could hear them in my mind, pushing me, pulling me, wrapping themselves around every corner of my consciousness. I was losing myself. But then something shifted. A feeling of coldness washed over me, a chill that crawled beneath my skin, freezing me in place. The creature was here, standing just beyond the edge of my perception. I could feel it, though I couldn't see it. My body stiffened, as though I were suddenly aware of every movement I made, every breath I took. My pulse quickened, but even the panic felt distant, as if it were happening to someone else. Is this real? The thought came again, but now it sounded different, more like a question I couldn't answer. It didn't matter. I could feel the weight of the question pressing down on me. It was as though I were in two places at once, my body in the desert, my mind elsewhere, floating between worlds. The lines between the two were blurring, fading. I couldn't tell where I ended and the creature began. The lizard. It was inside me now. Its eyes, those eyes, were everywhere. I couldn't remember if I was still seeing them or if I had become them. Had I always been here? Was I even alive? Or had I been dead this whole time, trapped in the world the creature had created for me? Was I simply a figment of its will, a reflection of its control? I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth moved, but the words had no meaning, no power. They dissolved into the air, as though they were part of the wind, part of the desert itself. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a voice still tried to fight back. This can't be happening. I have to survive. I have to find a way out. But the words felt hollow now. There was no escape. The more I tried to cling to that belief, the more my thoughts slipped away. I couldn't even tell where the creature began and I ended anymore. I closed my eyes, or at least I thought I did, and the world shifted again. I was standing at the edge of the desert. But no, it wasn't the desert. It was a vast, dark cavern, the walls covered with eyes. The ground beneath me was soft, and I felt something crawling on it, wrapping around my legs. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I felt my limbs grow heavy, as if they were no longer my own. And then, I saw it. The lizard. It was huge, massive, its scales shimmering in the dim light, its eyes glowing like burning coals. It was staring directly at me, its mouth open, as if it were ready to consume me whole. But there was something worse than the creature itself. It was me. I was the lizard. The eyes that had been watching me, controlling me, they were my eyes. I was the one who had been doing the watching, the controlling. I am the creature. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't just the lizard that had consumed me, it was myself that had given in. I had become what I feared the most. The creature didn't control me anymore. I had become it. Is this real? No answer. I was lost, drowning in my own mind, no longer able to tell where the hallucinations ended and reality began. There was nothing left but the endless spiral, the never-ending descent into madness. And in the darkness, in the silence, I heard its voice. My voice. You are mine now. The wind was howling, a ferocious gust that whipped through the desert, carrying with it the stench of dust and death. I stood there, frozen, facing the creature that had been chasing me, manipulating me, devouring my soul piece by piece. But I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't hide. The battle had come down to this moment, the moment when there was no escape. There was only one choice left. I had to face it. I drew a deep breath, feeling the parched air tear through my lungs, and yet there was no relief. The weight of the desert crushed me from all sides, but I forced myself to stand tall. I couldn't let it win. Not now. Not when everything had come to this point. I am not you. The words echoed through my mind. But were they my words? Or were they just the whispers of the creature, planted there to cloud my thoughts, to make me doubt myself? I swallowed, ignoring the pounding in my chest. The eyes. I could feel them again, watching me from every direction, those terrible, hypnotic eyes. The eyes that had drawn me in, made me weak, made me believe that I was nothing but a puppet to its will. But not now. Not anymore. I tried to take another step, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unyielding. My body trembled, my muscles stiff from exhaustion and fear, but I fought against the tremors. The creature wanted me weak, wanted me to surrender, to fall to its power without a struggle. I will not. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the haze that had clouded my mind. I could still hear it, its voice, its whispers, the soft hiss of its presence curling around me like a serpent. It wanted me to give in, to accept it, to let it control me. But I had a choice. I wasn't just some helpless victim. I was me. I could still fight. The creature moved. Slowly at first, like it was toying with me. I could see it now, its massive, scaled body gliding across the sand, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. It didn't need to move fast. It didn't need to hurry. It knew it had me. It knew I was broken. But I wasn't broken. Not yet. I clenched my fists, feeling the gritty sand between my fingers. I could still feel the warmth of the sun beating down on my skin. I could still hear the distant cries of the desert creatures, the soft rustling of the wind. I was still alive. And I would not die like this. Not at the mercy of a monster. Not in this forsaken place. The creature's eyes gleamed brighter now, a twisted smile playing across its grotesque face. It was moving closer, its enormous body casting a long, ominous shadow over me. Run. Turn away. It's too late. You can't win. The voice whispered again, seeping into my thoughts, wrapping itself around my mind like a vice. But this time, I didn't listen. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to focus. I locked eyes with the creature, refusing to look away. I could feel the pull, the terrible weight of its gaze, but I didn't break. I wouldn't. It lunged. The desert shifted beneath my feet, the ground seeming to tremble as the creature made its move. Its jaws snapped shut with a deafening crack, just inches from my face. I felt the heat of its breath on my skin, but I didn't flinch. I stepped back, narrowly avoiding its massive tail that whipped past me like a deadly scythe. The sand around me swirled as if the air itself had turned into an abyss, threatening to consume me. But I held my ground. I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. My body was tired, broken, aching in ways I couldn't describe. But my will, my determination, was stronger than ever. I wasn't going to let it take me without a fight. It growled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Its eyes flashed, and I could feel the weight of its influence trying to drag me back into its thrall. The creature was powerful, far more powerful than I had ever realized. But I was fighting back now. I was resisting. And in that moment, as I stood there facing the creature, my fear, my doubt, everything that had controlled me for so long, it all shattered. My mind cleared, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. I will not be your slave. I whispered the words to myself, over and over, as I met the creature's gaze one last time. It roared, its body writhing with fury. But I didn't back down. And in that moment, I knew I would survive. The creature reared up, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. It was as if the very air around us had thickened with its power, a pressure I could feel on my chest, tightening with every breath. I clenched my fists, my whole body trembling with the effort to resist, to push back against the force that had taken so much from me already. But there was something in the creature's gaze, something ancient, hypnotic, that I couldn't escape. I can't give in. The words echoed through my mind, a mantra of defiance. I surged forward, closing the distance between us, my body fueled by desperation. My heart raced in my chest, the blood pounding in my ears. I was ready to strike. I had to push it away, physically, mentally, anything to break free. I reached for a rock near my feet, heavy and jagged, its surface rough against my fingertips. With a primal grunt, I swung it towards the creature, aiming for its head, hoping to shatter its focus. I had to break that connection, had to sever the hold it had over me. The rock hit with a dull thud, but the creature didn't even flinch. It was as if the rock had never touched it. The force of my swing barely even moved its massive form. The creature, unfazed, tilted its head slightly, its eyes narrowing. It didn't need to speak. Its gaze alone was enough to stop me in my tracks. I froze. My muscles locked, my arms frozen in place, the rock slipping from my hand and falling to the ground with a soft thud. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The creature's eyes bore into mine, and once again, that suffocating, overwhelming presence surrounded me. It was like the air itself had become thicker, more oppressive, each breath heavier than the last. My thoughts slowed, fragmented, like I was sinking into some deep, endless abyss. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body betrayed me. I was trapped, paralyzed by the hypnotic power of the creature. I tried to look away, to break the connection, but it was like trying to turn my head while chained to the ground. The creature's eyes held me in place, each blink a shackle, tightening with every passing second. No! The scream was in my head, but it didn't make it past my lips. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic beat that seemed to drown out everything else. But nothing could stop the pull. Nothing could break its hold. My thoughts were becoming a blur. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. The sand beneath me began to swirl, and I felt my body grow heavy. The desert was no longer just a place. I felt like it was swallowing me whole. I was sinking, the ground beneath my feet becoming more and more distant, as if the very earth was receding into darkness. The creature's power was insurmountable. I could feel it, like a force of nature that no human will could stand against. It was ancient, unstoppable. It had been here long before me, and it would remain long after. And now, I was part of it. My thoughts, my soul, everything was slipping away. Don't look. I tried to close my eyes, but the pull of its gaze was too strong. I tried to fight, to move, but my body was no longer my own. It wasn't just my mind that was failing me, it was my very essence. I could feel myself becoming part of the creature, its will becoming my own, its thoughts merging with mine. I am nothing. The thought passed through my mind, but it wasn't my thought. It was the creature's, its voice, its power slipping into my consciousness, pushing mine further and further away. I was losing myself. The world had shrunk to just the two of us, the creature and me. There was nothing else. No desert, no wind, no sky above us. Just the crushing weight of its gaze and the suffocating pull of its presence dragging me deeper into its web. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. My mind felt numb, like a fog had descended and erased everything but the creature. I was lost, drowning in its hypnotic power. But then, somewhere deep inside me, there was a flicker. A small voice, fragile but defiant, broke through the haze. I am still here. The realization struck me like a jolt of lightning. I had been so focused on the creature's eyes, its overwhelming presence, that I hadn't noticed what had been happening all along. It wasn't just my mind it controlled. It was my body, too. Every movement, every step I had taken since I met this creature, each one had been dictated by it. My legs, my arms, my every muscle, they were not my own. I had thought I was making decisions, running, fighting back. But I had been its puppet all along, its strings pulling me without my knowledge. I had never been free. It controls me. It controls everything. The thought ripped through my mind, and with it, a surge of cold clarity. The creature was not just using fear to paralyze me. No, it was manipulating my very movements. Every step I took, every moment I hesitated, it was its doing. It had been feeding on my fear, yes, but it had also been feeding on my will, bending it to its own desires. I had allowed it to control me, to weave its threads around me so tightly that I couldn't even see the trap. I can fight it. I can fight back. The realization hit harder than the fear. I was not entirely lost. There was still something inside me, something human, a spark, a will that hadn't yet been consumed. And I was going to fight with everything I had left. I forced my hand to move, muscles screaming in protest. I couldn't look away from the creature's eyes, but I could feel the ground beneath me, the roughness of the sand, the sharp, painful pressure in my chest. I clenched my fists. I felt the weight of the stone in my hand again, the one I had dropped earlier. With everything I had left, I squeezed it tight. My fingers were raw, my skin burning with the effort, but I held on. I was still here. I wasn't going to let it take me. The creature's eyes flickered for a moment, as if it sensed the shift within me. It snarled, the air around us vibrating with its fury. Its form twisted and writhed, almost as though it was frustrated with me. It wanted me to give in, wanted me to remain its obedient servant, and yet, I was resisting. You can't control me anymore. With all my might, I threw the stone toward the creature. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The creature flinched, its concentration faltering for a split second as the stone struck its scales. The slightest hesitation in its gaze was all I needed. In that instant, I tore my eyes away, forcing them to look at the sky, the distant mountains, anything that wasn't its terrible, hypnotic stare. It was enough to break the grip, just for a moment. The moment was all I needed. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, each step a struggle against its pull, but I was no longer under its complete control. I wasn't free yet, but I could feel the chains weakening. I was fighting back now, not just physically, but mentally. I was pulling myself out of the fog, out of the darkness it had placed me in. I took another step, then another, and another. With every movement, the creature's power over me seemed to waver, like it was losing its grip, realizing that I wasn't just going to fall into its control without a fight. I am still here. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt something that had been long absent, hope. I could still fight. I would not let it win. The creature was relentless. It surged toward me, its massive form coiling like a serpent, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. The weight of its presence bore down on me once again, but this time I was ready. I refused to let its gaze take me again, refused to let it sink into my mind like the poison it had been. I was moving faster now, my feet stumbling over the uneven desert floor, but the creature was gaining. I could hear its breath, deep and guttural, as it closed the distance. The air was thick with its power, the desert suffocating under the weight of its presence. I can't outrun it. The thought chilled me to the core. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed my body, it would always be right behind me. The ground beneath me felt like quicksand, each step sinking further into despair. The horizon was nothing but a blur, the mountains. Distant, unreachable. The path I had taken seemed endless, a loop I could never escape from. It was like the creature had control over everything. The air, the earth, the very space around me, it was all bending to its will. And I was just another pawn, struggling to move in a game where the rules were set long before I even arrived. I glanced over my shoulder, desperate for some kind of advantage, but the sight of the creature only made my heart race harder. Its eyes were like black holes, pulling me in, drowning me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep running, but I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd be caught. I have to do something. The thought was a spark in my mind, flickering like a candle in a storm. There had to be a way. There had to be something I could do to survive. I gritted my teeth and pushed on, forcing myself to ignore the fear. My legs burned with exhaustion, and the harsh, dry air made it feel like my throat was closing with each breath, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The creature was too close now. Its shadow loomed over me like a monstrous cloud, darkening everything in its wake. I could feel the heat of its breath on the back of my neck, its fangs glinting in the faint light. The ground beneath my feet trembled with each step it took, and I knew, deep down, that if I didn't find a way to break free, I would be consumed. I need to fight back. I turned sharply, desperate to face it. My vision blurred with fear, but there was no time for hesitation. I had to do something, anything. I reached for anything that could be used as a weapon, anything that could give me an edge. My hands found a jagged rock, sharp and heavy, its surface rough under my trembling fingers. I gripped it tightly, holding it like a lifeline. The creature was mere feet away now, its glowing eyes fixed on me with such intensity that it felt like the world was shrinking to just the two of us. Time seemed to slow, and in that moment, I knew, if I didn't act now, I was done. It wasn't just my life on the line anymore, it was my very soul. With a scream of pure rage and fear, I lunged forward, swinging the rock with all my remaining strength. The creature hissed, its body twisting to avoid the blow, but I wasn't about to give up that easily. I swung again, and this time, the rock connected with its scales, sending a shockwave of pain through its form. But it wasn't enough. The creature's gaze locked onto mine once again, and I felt the familiar pull, the crushing weight of its control. My body froze, my limbs seizing up like iron chains had bound me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. This is it. The thought sliced through my mind like a cold knife. I was going to die here, alone, in this hellish desert, consumed by a creature that had no mercy. The world around me seemed to blur as I felt myself being drawn into the abyss, the last remnants of my will slipping away. But then, something shifted. A voice, a whisper, barely audible over the creature's hypnotic stare, cut through the darkness. You are still you. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't the creature's. It was something else. Something deeper. In that instant, a burst of clarity hit me like a flash of lightning. The creature's grip on me wasn't complete. It hadn't won. I still had something, some sliver of myself left, a final shred of defiance. And I wasn't going to let it take me. I am not its puppet. With everything I had left, I broke free. I tore my gaze away from the creature, forcing my head to turn just enough to break the connection. My body trembled with the effort, but I was free, if only for a moment. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. But I knew, deep down, that the fight wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its shadow was everywhere, swallowing the desert whole. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze still burning into my mind, even as I tore my eyes away. The desert around me seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating, pressing against my chest like a vice. I had no plan, no clear path ahead. The only thing I knew was that I couldn't stay here, not another second. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to run. My legs moved without thinking, each step frantic, fueled by pure desperation. I didn't care about the rocks scraping my skin or the burning in my lungs. I just needed to escape. I had to make it to somewhere safe, anywhere, please, let there be a place to hide. I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, the faintest tremor of the creature's pursuit. Every step I took seemed to bring it closer. I could hear its breathing now, deep and guttural, a constant reminder that it was always just behind me. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how much I tried to outrun it, I could feel its influence growing stronger with every passing second. Where's the escape? It was then that I saw it. In the distance, a jagged rock formation loomed, a series of narrow crevices between towering cliffs. A place to hide. A place to break the chase. My heart raced at the sight of it. I couldn't hesitate any longer. I had to make it there, now. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest, my vision blurring from exhaustion and fear. Every part of me was consumed by the need to survive, to reach that safety, that fleeting hope. I could hear the creature's movements growing louder, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that rock formation, the only chance I had left. I reached it, finally, just as my body threatened to collapse. My fingers scraped against the jagged stone as I pulled myself through the narrow opening between the cliffs. The world felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing tight against my sides as I squeezed through. The scent of dust and sweat clung to the air, the faint taste of blood in my mouth as I pushed forward, desperate for cover. I made it. The crevice was narrow, the walls towering above me, but it was enough. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The faintest sense of relief washed over me until I realized something. It was quiet. Too quiet. The sounds of the creature's pursuit had stopped. The deafening silence was a stark contrast to the chaos I had just escaped. But something was wrong. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the feeling. The oppressive, suffocating pressure that had been following me was still there, only now it was inside the crevice with me. I had escaped the physical chase, but the creature hadn't stopped. It had never stopped. The air around me grew colder, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and my hands trembled as I pressed them against the cool stone. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing, but no matter how hard I tried to calm myself, there was no escaping it. The creature had followed me here, into my mind. It's inside me now. I couldn't stop shaking. It was as if I had crossed a threshold, a point of no return. I had escaped the creature physically, but at what cost? My body might have found refuge in this small crevice, but my mind was slipping away, consumed by the same darkness that had haunted me from the start. The walls of the narrow passageway pressed in on me, like the very rock was closing around me, squeezing the sanity out of me. The creature's influence was here, in the silence, in the shadows, in the thoughts that twisted and turned in my head, whispering. I could still feel it, see its eyes, those eyes, lurking in the corners of my mind, pulling me toward madness. It's too late. The thought hit me with a terrible finality. There was no escaping the creature now. I had made it to safety physically, but it didn't matter. The true price of my survival was not just my body, it was my mind, my sanity. I could feel myself slipping, the world around me becoming more and more distorted, like a dream that was too real, too horrifying to be real. I had outrun the creature, yes, but in doing so, I had lost the most important part of myself. There is no escape. I clutched my head in my hands, the sensation of the creature's presence growing stronger. I could feel it, could hear it in my thoughts now. It was never going to leave me. It had already won. And with that thought, I realized the terrible truth. I was already its slave. I woke up with a jolt, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was different, fresher, less oppressive than the desert. It smelled like sunscreen, dust, and faintly of coffee. I blinked against the harsh light, my eyes squinting as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. Where was I? The ground beneath me was solid, not the uneven, rocky terrain of the desert. I was lying on a hard bench, my back aching, and a faint hum of distant voices buzzed in my ears. It took me a moment to register the familiar sounds, the soft murmur of tourists, the rustling of papers, the quiet clinking of mugs, the dull clatter of everyday life. A tourist center. I slowly lifted my head, feeling the dizziness in my skull. My hands trembled as I reached for my face, the coolness of my skin a stark contrast to the burning heat I had felt in the desert. What had happened? The last thing I remembered was the creature, those eyes, those hypnotic, inescapable eyes, and the overwhelming feeling that it was coming for me. That I was running. But now I was here. Safe, apparently. I tried to gather my thoughts, but they were fragmented, broken pieces scattered across a chasm in my mind. How had I gotten here? I couldn't remember. The journey, the chase, it all felt like a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't shake off. The memory of the desert, the relentless pursuit, the fear, it lingered in my mind like a fog, thick and suffocating, but I couldn't recall the details. Everything was slipping through my fingers like sand. A woman's voice broke through my disorienting thoughts. Are you okay? You've been out for a while. I turned slowly, the voice familiar but distant. A woman in a uniform, the kind worn by park rangers, was standing by my side, her expression concerned but calm. She looked at me as if I was just another tourist who had taken a little too long on the trail. Why, yeah, I stammered, my voice raw, as though I hadn't spoken in hours. Maybe I hadn't. What happened? How did I? She shook her head, her lips curling into a polite but distant smile. You were found near the trail a couple of miles from here. You looked disoriented, exhausted. Didn't even know how you got there. We've been trying to reach your group, but... Her words trailed off as she noticed the look in my eyes. I wasn't sure if it was pity or concern, but it made the unease inside me grow. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be alive. I had run. I had escaped. But the truth was, I hadn't escaped. Had I? The woman continued, unaware of my inner turmoil. We've had a few hikers go missing recently in the area, so we're glad to see you're okay. But you're lucky, someone must have been watching out for you. Her words pierced through me. Someone was watching out for me? No one had been. It was it. The creature. I could feel it, even now, lurking beneath my skin. That presence, the shadow I had tried to outrun. But it hadn't let me escape, had it? I could still feel its eyes, its control. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I wasn't okay, that something was horribly wrong, but I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat. The desert. The creature. It was all blending together, a web of insanity, and I was tangled in it. I forced myself to sit up, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of confusion. My thoughts were fragmented, like a puzzle missing pieces. I looked around, hoping to anchor myself to something familiar. The center seemed normal, too normal. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't the same. Whatever had followed me in the desert, whatever had come into my mind, was still there. It had never left. I glanced at my reflection in the window opposite me, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, just a flicker, a shadow in the corner of my eye. but when I turned, it was gone. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus on the present. I'm safe. I'm okay. But that voice inside me, the creature's voice, whispered in my mind, telling me otherwise. You're not safe. You never were. My body tensed, a shiver running down my spine. I wanted to deny it, to scream out that it wasn't real. But deep down, I knew it was never going to end. I sat up, my hands still shaking, gripping the edge of the bench as if it might anchor me to reality. The ranger was still standing by, watching me with a concerned expression, but I was no longer focused on her. My mind was reeling, and I needed answers. I had to make them understand. I was still trying to piece together my memories, but it felt like everything was slipping further away with each passing second. The desert, the creature, the chase, it was all there, but it was fading. And now, here I was, in a place where everything felt wrong, too normal for the madness I had just experienced. Are you feeling better? The ranger asked again, her voice soft, but it only irritated me. I wanted her to listen. I needed someone to understand. I nodded slowly, trying to force some semblance of normalcy into my words. I was in the desert, I said, my voice trembling. There was something there, something following me. The ranger blinked, a confused frown crossing her face. Something following you? She asked, clearly trying to make sense of my words. What do you mean? It's just the desert. Sometimes people get disoriented out there, especially in the heat. No, I interrupted, my voice rising. You don't understand. There was something. I paused, my throat tightening. How could I explain it? How could I make them understand? I stood up abruptly, nearly losing my balance, but I steadied myself. I needed to show them. I needed someone to believe me. I'm telling you, there was this thing. A lizard, but not like any lizard. It was huge. And I stopped again, noticing how ridiculous it must have sounded. I don't know. It had these eyes, these hypnotic eyes, and it was controlling me. It made me do things, made me go places I didn't want to go. The ranger's expression softened, but not in the way I hoped. She gave a small sigh, as if she were comforting a child. You've been through something intense, I can see that, she said gently. But it sounds like you've had a rough time up there in the sun. Maybe dehydration or heat exhaustion. It can mess with your mind. You should drink some water, rest up. I felt my frustration build. Was this how it was going to be? Was everyone just going to dismiss what had happened to me? I could still hear that voice in my head, that low, hypnotic hum. I could feel its presence lurking, always near, and I knew it was still with me. No, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. You don't get it. It's not just the heat. Something was following me. And I think it's still here. I turned around, desperate for anyone to hear me. But when I looked at the others in the center, a small group of tourists sitting at a nearby table, I saw only confusion and pity in their eyes. A man with a camera slung around his neck gave me an uncertain look. Hey, you okay, man? He asked. His voice was low, like he didn't want to make things worse. I'm not okay, I snapped, before catching myself. I'm not. You have to listen to me. There's something unnatural out there. The man shrugged awkwardly, glancing at the others who now seemed uncomfortable. We all saw some weird stuff on the trail, dude, he said, laughing nervously. I mean, desert heat does strange things to your brain. Maybe you were just hallucinating? I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to scream that it wasn't a hallucination, that I wasn't crazy. But how could I convince them when even I wasn't sure what was real anymore? One of the women at the table looked at me sympathetically. Maybe you should talk to the ranger more, she suggested. She can get you in touch with someone who can help. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. They were treating me like a case, like something that could be fixed with a few words of reassurance and some rest. But nothing would fix what had happened. Nothing could make the terror go away. The ranger spoke again, her voice soft but firm. Why don't you sit back down for a while? Get some water. We'll make sure you're okay. I stared at her, at all of them, a deep, gnawing sense of isolation creeping over me. They didn't get it. They couldn't. But I had to make them understand somehow. I had to warn them. Without thinking, I turned away from them, my mind consumed with the need to escape, to get away from this place. From them. I couldn't stay here. The desert was still out there, and whatever I have run from, it was still coming. And they would never believe me in time. I stood there, at the edge of the tourist center, my hands still trembling, the ground beneath me feeling oddly unsteady. The others, the tourists, the ranger, they were all just background noise now, as if I was detached from this place, from reality itself. My thoughts were far away, drifting in a haze. Part of me had never truly left that desert, had never truly escaped what I had seen. The thing that had chased me, the lizard with its hypnotic eyes, it had followed me here. I tried to focus on the present. The tourists were laughing, talking about their hikes and how much fun they had. But all I could hear was the faint buzzing in my ears, a distant echo of the hum I had heard back in the desert. I could feel my heart racing again, the blood pounding in my temples, but the fear was different now. It wasn't the fear of being hunted anymore, it was the fear that I had already lost. They were right. I had lost. I was not the same. How could I be? How could I stand here, surrounded by people, pretending everything was fine when I knew that something horrible, had changed me? I glanced at my hands, feeling them shake uncontrollably. They looked foreign, disconnected from my body, as though I were looking at someone else's hands. My chest tightened. It was like a part of me had stayed in the desert, in that dark, endless place, and I was just a hollow shell standing in front of them. Maybe I'm just crazy, I muttered to myself. The words didn't feel like my own, just a faint echo of doubt, seeping into my mind. Maybe none of it was real. Maybe it was just the heat. Just the sun. I don't know. The words didn't bring comfort. They didn't reassure me. They only made the silence more oppressive, the truth more elusive. It didn't matter what I told myself. What mattered was that the feeling, the presence, was still there. That weight, that looming, invisible pressure, it was as if the lizard's eyes were still on me, even here. Even now. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. The images flashed again, those eyes, the creature, the desert. The echoes of its presence were too vivid, too real. It was like a part of me had been absorbed into the vast, barren stretch of land. I had become a part of it. I could still feel the desert's dry heat clinging to my skin, the dust in my lungs. I could still hear the winds whispering my name, as though calling me back. My body trembled again. I opened my eyes, staring at the tourists who seemed so unaffected, so normal. They couldn't understand. They would never understand. The fear wasn't just in my mind. It wasn't just something that could be explained away. It was real. And it was inside me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I needed to go back to the desert, to face it again, to find the part of me that had stayed behind. Because if I didn't face it, I would be trapped in this limbo, a prisoner to my own mind, to the vision of that creature, to the pull of the desert. "Are you okay?" The ranger's voice pulled me back to reality, but it felt so distant. Her voice seemed almost like a whisper, a part of some dream I couldn't escape. "I need to leave," I said, barely hearing my own words. The ranger looked at me with concern. "You're not well. Maybe you should rest more." "No," I said more forcefully. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. I could feel it. I turned to walk away, but my legs felt heavy, as if something was holding me back. A part of me was already gone, and I had no idea if I could ever get it back. The desert had claimed it. And no matter how far I went, no matter how many people I spoke to, that part of me would never leave the sand, the wind, the shadow of that lizard. It was already too late. And I would never be free. I didn't know why I'd wandered into the restroom. The sound of voices, the laughter, the cheerful bustle of the tourist center, all of it felt distant, as if it didn't belong to me. I needed a moment, just a moment, to collect myself. The mirror caught my attention the moment I stepped inside. I hadn't really looked at myself since I'd arrived. I barely paid attention to my reflection on the way here, too distracted by the constant hum in my ears, by the heaviness in my chest. But now, as I stood before the mirror, I felt the pull, something I couldn't quite explain. I leaned in closer, almost instinctively. The face in front of me was mine, yet somehow it wasn't. My skin was pale, too pale, drained of the warmth that had once been there. My eyes were what caught me off guard. They weren't right. I blinked, hoping to clear the image, but it only deepened. A shimmer, a gleam, was there, deep in my irises. It wasn't the light. It wasn't some trick of the reflection. The gleam was like the hypnotic shine of that creature's eyes. The same eyes that had paralyzed me in the desert, that had drawn me in, making me forget everything. The same eyes that I had struggled to escape from. I reached up, touching my face, as though trying to make sure it was really me. My fingers grazed my eyelids, as if to confirm the truth. My breath caught. My reflection wasn't just staring back at me. It was staring through me, as though it knew something I didn't, as if it wasn't me at all. It was like the desert had marked me, branded me with that terrible connection, and I had no way of shaking it off. I saw it, that glow, pulsing faintly in my eyes. The more I stared, the more I felt myself being pulled in, drawn into a vortex that was not my own. The world around me blurred. My pulse quickened. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. I could feel it again, that presence, as though it were right beside me. But it wasn't. It was inside me. I staggered back from the mirror, my legs unsteady beneath me, as if I had no control over them. The feeling was overwhelming, suffocating. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, I saw it, the reflection of the lizard's eyes in my own. It was there, hidden in the depths of my gaze, lurking, waiting. My hand trembled as it dropped to my side. I couldn't fight it. The desert had already taken a part of me, and now it had come to claim the rest. My own reflection had become a reminder that I would never be the same, that I was already changed. I tried to move, to leave, but the thought of walking away felt impossible. The pull of my own gaze, the pull of the creature that had marked me, was too strong. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, minutes, hours, maybe longer. All I knew was that I wasn't looking into a mirror anymore. I was looking into the eyes of the desert, and it was looking back. I stumbled away from the mirror, my mind swimming in a sea of confusion and dread. The world around me had lost its solidity, as though everything had become distant, like I was walking through a fog that refused to lift. My body felt light, as though it were no longer entirely mine, as though I was just a passenger inside it. My thoughts spun faster and faster, spiraling into an abyss I couldn't escape. I had tried so hard to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, that the desert and the lizard were nothing more than hallucinations brought on by heat and isolation. I had told myself that I could move on, that I could put everything behind me. But standing here now, feeling the cold sweat on my brow, the trembling in my hands, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. The lizard, it was still with me. It had followed me back from the desert, and now it was in my mind, a part of me that I could never escape. The hypnotic gleam in my reflection, that familiar pull, was no longer just a memory. It was alive, breathing, echoing in every corner of my mind. I staggered toward the door, trying to push through the disorienting fog of my thoughts, but it was like wading through thick mud. My mind kept dragging me back, to that moment in the desert, to the eyes that had captured me. My body had never truly escaped, had never really left the grip of those eyes. I could feel them still, watching me, pulling at me, and it was as though I could never outrun them. I stepped outside, the sunlight harsh against my face, but it didn't help. The world was wrong. I could still hear the whispers of the wind in the desert, the low hiss of the lizard's breath. I could still feel the heat, the suffocating pressure, as though it were all pressing in on me, even here. The people around me were laughing again, chatting, oblivious to the storm that raged inside my mind. But I couldn't join them. I couldn't pretend anymore. I had looked into the eyes of the lizard. I had let it into my soul. And now it was a part of me. It would always be there, a shadow lurking in the depths of my thoughts. It had broken me, fractured my mind, and there was no going back. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run back into the desert, to face it one last time, to end the nightmare. But I knew it was pointless. The lizard had already won. It had taken me. There was no escape. As I walked away, I could feel it. The cold, oppressive weight of its presence pressing in on me, urging me to follow, to listen. I had thought that coming here, to the safety of the tourist center, would somehow help me heal. But it was nothing more than an illusion. The desert was inside me now. And no matter how far I ran, it would always be with me. There was no going back. I had crossed a line, and I had been marked. The lizard had claimed me, and I had lost. I didn't know what would happen to me now. Would I fade away, like a memory that was too painful to remember? Or would I be trapped, forever walking the thin line between madness and reality, never able to return to the life I once knew? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was no longer who I had been. The lizard had changed me, and I would never be the same. And as I walked into the fading light of the day, I felt its eyes on me once more. The days that followed were a blur. No one noticed the subtle shift in me, the way my eyes had become distant, as though I were staring into a place that no one else could see. The world outside moved on, indifferent to what had happened in the desert, to the darkness that had wrapped itself around my mind. I tried to live again. I returned to my old routines, forced myself to smile at the familiar faces, to speak of things that once mattered. But every conversation felt hollow, like I was a stranger wearing my old skin. The things I used to enjoy, simple things, no longer brought comfort. The world, in its simplicity, seemed unreal to me, like a dream I could never wake up from. At night, when the room fell silent, I could feel it. The creeping sense of presence. The weight in the air. It was there, in the dark, always lurking just at the edge of my consciousness. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and hear the soft whisper of the wind, the same wind I had heard in the desert. The same wind that carried the hiss of the lizard's breath. Some nights, I would wake up gasping for air, as if I were drowning, and the reflection in the mirror would greet me with those same eyes, those gleaming, hypnotic eyes, watching me from within. I had thought I could escape, but I was wrong. The lizard had never left. It was always there, inside me, just as real as my own heartbeat. And so, I moved through life like a ghost, drifting from place to place, never fully present. The world outside seemed to spin around me, bright and full of life, while I was stuck in the shadows of my own mind. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I had seen the darkness. I had looked into its eyes, and now it had become a part of me. Forever. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.